A news item. In July 2002, the president of a major American television network announced to an assembly of TV critics that one of the highlights of the network's next year of programming would be a biographical miniseries. The announcement was met by a hailstorm of outrage, catching the network president by surprise with its ferocity. He probably shouldn't have been so surprised. The subject of the biography to be was Adolf Hitler. Santa Monica's Ocean Avenue sits on a bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. It has a wide boulevard running between the street and the cliff, along which jog the wealthy and powerful, threading their way among the flotsam and jetsam of the American dream. I know it quite well. I once spent a month here doing a film about the Dalai Lama of Tibet. Throughout my documentary film career, I've tried to explore the good in human beings. Now it seemed my karma was breaking on the opposite shore. Just a few blocks away, at the LA offices of Alliance Atlantis, there was blood on the floor.
Wow.
A conference call was underway, spanning both coasts in Europe, as the local executive producers, the writer in New York and the director in Prague, all listened to the comments of the network execs at CBS. The network, who'd been taking the hammering in the press, didn't like many things about the latest script.
And what I'm hearing is slightly more sweeping than that.
This would not be a terribly troubling occurrence for the people in this room, but for the fact that they'd already spent a year on the script, were on their second writer, and had to start shooting in 2 months. The executive producer whose baby this was, Ed Gernon, Alliance Atlantis' main movie man in LA, was deeply vexed. Some of his most cherished ideas were meeting a premature end.
I do need to get my head clear about exactly where we are and where we have fallen down so miserably, because I feel like my instincts about what it needs to be are not matching up.
Late at night, Ed's emotions were more tethered, but he was just as concerned for the project's vision.
I don't think anybody in this project, and I especially mean the network, is consciously trying to undermine the project or to trivialize it or to undercut it. I think everyone is coming to it with just the right idea about let's get it right. But I think this material is seductive in dark and weird ways, and that not that there's some evil force that hangs over it, but that it's a living example of how good men can do bad things for good reasons.
For the producers of the miniseries, the question was, how did this fanatical demagogue arise? This man who would lead a highly civilized people off a moral precipice to assembly line mass murder. What social, political, and psychological conditions made it possible? For me as a documentary filmmaker, there was a further question. How do you make a biographical drama true to the facts about a man whose evil has swollen beyond facts to mythic proportions? A man who has become almost a cardboard cutout for ruthlessness. The producers needed a bulletproof consultant. They sought out Hitler's foremost contemporary biographer.
And we found Ian Kershaw, unimpeachable scholar. His book is not so much a biography, but as a wonderful and thorough history. And his basic premise, and one that even Germans seem to embrace, is that look not to the man, but look to the people.
Kershaw's name on the project muted much of the media criticism, which ranged from fears that any portrayal of his younger years would make Hitler subject to sympathy, to serious doubts that such a complex story could be told within the confines of network television. Unstated, but lurking beneath every article seemed to be a dread of resurrecting the most horrific mass murderer in human history. However, with Kershaw on board, many critics cut the project some slack, taking a wait-and-see attitude. A few weeks after my visit to Santa Monica, Kershaw quietly removed himself from the film. The reasons would be made clear later, but at that point, with less than 2 months before shooting was to begin in Prague, and without the anchor of the Kershaw biography, I was beginning to wonder if the film might be pulled off course when such powerful undercurrents were tugging at it from so many directions. One does not play lightly with the symbols of evil. Prague. The past has collided with the present. Though the ancient buildings are there, the dark communist-era city I knew for 4 years as a film student has disappeared. International corporations have replaced it with a fashionable European town just like any other, except perhaps more like out of a fairy tale. But I've plunked down not in the Brothers Grimm, but in grim reality.
Here's the segue.
With 3 weeks before shooting, Ed and director Christian Duguay are spending hours every day reworking the script and telephoning notes to the writer in New York. Christian has had something of a meltdown, quit and come back. The main role of Hitler is still not cast.
What are we going to do?
The production is almost $2 million over budget, and savings are hard to find.
Why do we need that? I was looking at that in
The director is resisting pressure to shoot on 16mm instead of 35. If this is to be, his director of photography will walk.
All over again. And we don't have a script. We're racing to the floor. We've got
Nerves are getting frayed, bodies exhausted.
I gotta tell you, it's hard to have those conversations with a camera pointing at me because it cuts half of
I asked Christian why he had quit.
At some point, I saw that we were a month and a half from going on the floor, and we were still opening books and try to understand ourselves what people took decades, to write. I mean, it's scary. It is really, really scary.
Although the script is a constantly shifting target, with shooting only 2 weeks away, locations have to be surveyed by the entire technical crew. Obtaining the locations has posed a problem. Sensitivities about the Second World War still run very deep here.
just the notion that we would be shooting a film has ruffled a few feathers. And we have found that it's more difficult to get locations when Hitler is in the script that they invariably want to look at. So we instead just took it off the title.
The Czech lands were occupied for most of the last 300 years. Independence finally arrived at the end of the First World War. It was extinguished in 1938 by Adolf Hitler. After the Second World War, the country quickly fell into the hands of the Soviets and another totalitarian police state that lasted 40 years. I arrived to study at the Film Academy at the end of June 1968, the height of the great explosion of hope known as the Prague Spring. On the 21st of August, in the early hours of the dawn, I stood on this same Wenceslas Square as Russian tanks rolled up the street, crushing that hope, just as Hitler's panzers had some 3 decades before. Another 22 years of repressive rule would follow. The sensitivities here run deep, and I knew that in many quarters an American television drama about Hitler would be thought of as presumptuous. National artist Otakar Vavra was my head professor at the Film Academy. Now 92 and still sharp as nails, he made over 50 feature films.
What does he think about an American production coming here to do the life of Hitler?
The 6 of us in his 4th-year class were invited on the set of one of them, Days of Treason, about the events leading up to the Munich Conference of 1938 that sold out Czechoslovakia.
Americans who have only known democracy can never imagine what totalitarianism actually was. The atmosphere of fascism, it was terrible. No one knew when they would be taken away or be beaten up in the street. I saw that with my own eyes. They started to kick a Czech to death, and no one stopped. Everyone quickly walked by and left him lying there. It's difficult for Americans to imagine this. It was really sheer horror.
The casting department has been trying for months to cast the right actor to play Hitler. Now there is a breakthrough.
You guys keep going. It's Joan Hyler.
Robert Carlyle, the highly regarded Scottish actor, was set to play Hitler in a rival BBC production. That film was recently cancelled. Apparently, the producers had received threats. But Carlyle, who has already done research, is very keen to do this production.
Okay, we got Robert Carlyle. How fucking exciting is that?
Bobby Carlyle? Hi, this is Christian Duguay. Bonjour. J'espère que vous parlez français parce que moi je parle pas un mot d'anglais, hein?
Thank you. Bye.
Here's what I was about to say. Robert, hi, this is Christian Duguay. I hope you don't mind if we speak to you in French because it's going to be more subtle when I give you directions. Bon.
There's only one hitch.
He's not actually hired until after the accent's been heard by CBS.
Wow.
CBS wants assurance that he can do the Austrian accent without sounding Scottish.
Anyway, as I was saying, small companies of professional actors started to form around the first half of the 16th century.
After looking at the tape, the network asks the producers to change the Austrian and German accents that have been planned for the entire cast into something more mid-Atlantic.
Thus giving a clear view of the actors to a large audience who would gather around them.
Yeah, you're gonna work in the customs office just like I did. You think you're better than me, you're not better than me.
He thinks he's special. He's not special. He's no better than his old man.
Look, I'm with you, Dad.
10 days before the start of filming, the 10 and 17-year-old Hitlers have not yet been cast. They test some local kids.
Tell him not to do too much with his eyes. Let it just happen. It's too much. That's too much. Tell him to give me a different expression.
Hi, yeah, this time let's not have the mother somehow. So maybe just bring the kid up.
How do you get a kid in touch with so much anger, you know?
I think it's that weirdness that you want, though.
Yes.
That kid's weird.
He's approaching it, but he doesn't...
Historians disagree on what, if anything, in his childhood made Hitler Hitler and led to the death camps, the mass executions, the 52 million dead in the Second World War.
Beady eyes, tiny little mouth, huge head, and a monstrous ego. That kid is...
Yeah. Attracting big crowd.
Mm-hmm.
The bow tie will be then, of course, also close on his.
But what led from his birth in the Austrian hinterland to the final solution is still bitterly disputed. The problem is that there are gaping holes in the historical record. Files and people who knew too much disappeared, mostly under the orders of Hitler himself. Hitler worked very hard to create a heroic mythology about himself, and he knew very well that it would be much more effective if it was not burdened with the cumbersome facts of a personal history. Nevertheless, any biography of Hitler, even one that attempts to tell the story through the society around him, must inevitably grapple with the cause of his evil.
I believe that he's a sociopath. It seemed to us that he was a creature who looks human, who sounds human, but in fact who is profoundly flawed, not human.
For Ed, who once spent 6 months developing a script on the serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, Hitler was right off of the same page of sociopathy theory. A person unlike most of us, innately evil, constructed by nature without a conscience.
And that difference, that distinction, is what confounds the people around him. No one can quite grasp the depth of his sociopathy, the degree to which he hates people, the degree to which he doesn't feel pain.
Ed and Christiane had flown to London for a day where they found their 10-year-old Hitler, a very nice up-and-coming child star with natural acting talent.
What happened?
You have a very bad signal. You need to get a better... Or position yourself, put the antenna where it needs.
Do your homework!
It's good for him. He's stubborn. He is arrogant. He doesn't listen.
Which is perfectly normal for a boy his age.
He is God's punishment on me for marrying my niece.
Now, Uncle, don't be absurd.
You like him? He has no friends.
He's our failure and an embarrassment, and he'll come to no good!
You know, in the end, you'll get what you want. You'll be an artist, a painter, anything you want. Oh, my little genius.
You hate him. I want to feel this. That's it. Again, that's little nod. That was good. Again.
If acting talent, among other things, can be innate, could not evil? Or in Hitler's case, was it acquired from a highly troubled family life? By speculating that his father was violent and his mother overindulgent, the script seemed to be leaving open both possibilities.
Listen up. I want you at the top of the...
You little bastard.
Despite the brutal family scenes, for Ed, the cause of Hitler's evil was ultimately a mystery.
That you cannot answer the question, what makes him who he is? The best we can do, in fact, the only lesson that can come out of any examination of that particular story was, how was he possible?
But as an actor developing a role, Bobby Carlyle needed to understand what made him.
I have to say that you can't possibly go approach any character thinking, well, this guy's a complete monster, and being frightened of that and being afraid of that. You have to embrace it in the same way as any other character you play, and you have to embrace the strengths and the weaknesses and the foibles of that character, and of course this guy's got many. But no, I'm looking for why. I'm not looking for, you know what I mean, anything other than why. You can start in the simplest form, I suppose. I can empathise and understand the loss of his mother. Because I kind of lost my mother in a different way when I was 4 years old. So I can understand that, and the grief that causes. So that doesn't excuse anything, and you know, it's needless to say it doesn't excuse anything, but you can see the development of the mind. It was me.
It was you. Once upon a time. The last poor nose.
No straight. We'll see you again later, don't you worry.
Yeah, you lose yourself. Totally. I used to be so pretty.
Bobby had brought a stand-in, someone of his height and build who would be in his place during shot setups. Simon Sullivan was a young actor just out of drama school. Christiane, returning from England without a 17-year-old Hitler, tested Simon and he got the part.
Would you can't believe you just walked in and just started talking to me and don't say anything at all.
Adolf, I know you how you look. Would you like to be dressed here or in your
I have to say, I was frightened to death. I could not believe it, what I saw.
So real.
So real. Whoa.
For wardrobe head Maria Schicker, the shock of seeing Bobby summoned emotional memories of the price her German family paid for Hitler.
It went all through. It was like a film. I saw my past, and I saw my mom's past, and I saw my family. And, you know, blame it on the Germans. They are humans too. You know, there is no differences.
Hey.
Hey.
Oh my God. That's as late as you go on the show, right? Jesus. Great. What do you think? Wow.
Bobby.
Shit, fuck piss, man.
Maybe we can more weapons. Expression profile. That's good.
You are obstinate. You are lazy. And if you do not pay closer attention to your lessons, young man, I will speak to your father. Is that understood? Understood? Discipline is the German ideal. A combination of strength, determination, and purity.
Another school of thought about the origins of Hitler's evil has him more as a fanatical ideologue rather than a born sociopath, absorbing the intense nationalism and Aryan mythology that was especially strong among the German population of Austria. A variation on this is that Hitler, like Napoleon, was a borderland personality, someone who grew up outside their country and therefore overcompensated in their national identity.
Ladies and gentlemen of Vienna, we are a magnificent people. Our culture bears that out. Mozart, Beethoven.
As for his exposure to anti-Semitism, it was very prevalent in most of Europe during this time.
Not one of them a foreigner. None of them Jews.
The problem that many people have with this school of thought of Hitler as fanatic ideologue is that in their eyes it diminishes his evil. By being convinced of his beliefs, no matter how warped they were, they fret that Hitler was not intentionally doing wrong. But why would fanaticism make him any less responsible for his actions? Or does the real reason why they prefer to see him as intentionally evil go deeper?
Welcome to Vienna. It's full of immigrants.
Most of what we do know about his early days has been told by his friend August Kubitschek from their time together in Linz and Vienna. Hitler as a youth was domineering and narcissistic, worshipped Wagner's operas, and was convinced he would become a great artist. When his dream was shattered by the Vienna Academy of Art, who refused to accept him as a student, and his inheritance was all spent, rather than find a job, he took to the streets and flophouses of Vienna, making a meager living as a painter of Vienna's landmarks for Jewish art dealers, and earning enough eventually to remove himself to Munich and the German motherland, where during the declaration of war in the Odeonplatz, the first known image of him as an adult was caught in a photograph. Hitler immediately joined up, and for the first time in his adult life, felt at home.
Expression number 1 is at 6 seconds.
But because so much historical evidence from those early years has disappeared, and because the emotions over his later crimes are so highly charged, when telling his story, pitfalls the size of bomb craters lurk at every turn.
That's come!
Hitler served as a message runner during the war, and while it's generally acknowledged that he was a good and brave soldier, winning 2 Iron Crosses, the film throws cold water on this, saying that in order to get one of them, he emotionally blackmailed his Jewish commanding officer.
What do you mean it won't happen? I followed your orders, sir.
I may have spoken too quickly, Corporal.
I deserve this medal. I risked my life.
We all risk our lives. Every day.
You gave me your word, Lieutenant.
Believe me, if it were up to me.
I did believe you. Anyone else would have laughed.
What do you mean by that?
I've always stood up for you Jews. When anyone says, oh, you can't trust them, I point to you, sir.
Peter Sussman is the CEO of the entertainment group for Alliance Atlantis.
You know, we're trying to make the definitive film, and while not all the facts are known, and while sometimes for cinematic purposes, you know, we have to condense certain time frames or periods or whatever, all, as I said, with a great attention to whether the essence of the facts are still there or the theme of the facts or whatever, what we don't want is a film where there's anything that's objectively, factually inaccurate. So in those few occasions where we've done something or, you know, scripted it in a way, we are taking, quote, dramatic license. But as I said earlier, it won't be anything that anyone can say is factually incorrect. The worst they can say it's not known.
But what's not known allows a very broad latitude to interpret history, even while trying to stay true to the essence of the facts. For instance, in Hitler's behavior with the dog that he found during the war, the filmmakers teeter along the edge between dramatic license and fictional invention. It's widely accepted that Hitler loved animals, though many historians point out that it was probably because he could bend them to his own will.
Sit! Sit! What are you trying to do? Chew at me!
Nevertheless, there is no record of Hitler beating any of his dogs except once, some 10 years later, when his Alsatian got into a fight with another dog. I asked Ed, what was the justification for this scene?
As I say, I'm only interested in being true to the spirit of this event. And I've seen footage, this dog, it's a German Shepherd, that he wants so badly to connect to. And the dog winces when he comes near. Now, I'm a dog owner. They do not wince unless they've been beaten. They just don't. And it's pretty clear to me and to a few other folks, I showed it to some people who train dogs. And the only explanation is that he was abusive. And it makes sense when you look at how he ran his personal relationships.
This does raise the issue, though, that exists in all historical drama. If the audience does not know that some events they are seeing are true only to the filmmaker's essence of the history, they may come away with the mistaken idea that these events actually happened. Some historians seem to accept this as a necessary part of dramatizing history.
It's whether, in fact, the ultimate issue, the ultimate purpose, the ultimate direction of what's happening is maintained. If truth and honesty is maintained in that respect, one cannot argue with it.
Nicholas Goodrick Clark is an English historian who has written extensively about the roots of Nazism.
So you could live with Hitler burning down his father's beehives, Hitler beating his dog in the trenches of World War I?
No, I don't feel very comfortable with that.
Also, I had to wonder if they could have balanced it by showing him being affectionate with the dog. And the dog eventually disappeared, though I suppose he could have been killed in a shell explosion.
Christian. I have the budget for a full dog. Half budget. You cut the budget of the dog in half.
But perhaps if they had showed him, even for a moment, as nice to the dog, good numbers of the audience would object. And maybe some, victims of the man, would feel hurt beyond bearable measure. Are the responsibilities of telling this story so immense, or is the network frightened of a backlash? The question needed asking, were the producers painting a darker picture of Hitler than the historical record of those years presented, reducing what was obviously a very complex character into something more acceptable for their audience?
You think there's moments that suggest that Hitler is a darker character than
Maybe he was in the historical record at the particular point in time where those events are taking place.
Yeah, well, a couple things. I don't think we are, in fact, doing that. Secondly, it's hard to imagine audiences believing.
Well, there you go.
You know that
we're on that side.
Well, they were making Hitler too dark. I mean, you know, hey, I can pull out a lot of press for you that are suggesting we're going to make him our best pal. You know, which is of course nonsense.
Perhaps also the difficulties lie in that anyone who tries to tell this story is not only dealing with an incomplete, controversial history, but with a powerful mythology as well.
Hitler has somehow become inflated in the post-war era, particularly since the 1960s, into some archetypal figure of evil. It was almost a kind of titillation for the media to indulge an image of Hitler that was frightening and obscene and extraordinary. Some overwhelming demonic presence that will turn our whole world upside down and threatens to engulf us. It's a quick way of redrawing the boundaries in black and white, restoring some kind of cognitive order to a world that might in fact involve many shades of grey, where discrimination or judgment may be necessary.
Most, perhaps all of drama is underpinned with archetypes of evil and good, a fact that has not escaped the editors of the miniseries.
Right now, I think for the majority, Hitler is a symbol of evil. You have to keep that in mind as the fourth element in the movie. You are going to bend history to a certain extent. You can, because it is if you're making something for a large audience, and you can only take small steps away from what you perceive as their truth.
You're not blind, Corporal. Gas wouldn't do that. It irritates the eyes.
But by dramatizing Hitler as anything less than a complex and multidimensional human being, are the filmmakers encouraging their public to perceive him as so abnormal that he becomes a rare historical aberration, rather than an extreme example of something that is perhaps quite common? Hitler, recovering from the gas attack, learned that Germany had surrendered. The shock of what he believed to be a betrayal by the politicians was devastating. The script speculates that in hospital he had a psychotic episode. We'll never know. The hospital records were later seized by the Gestapo. In Mein Kampf, he writes that he had a vision that he would devote the rest of his life to politics, to rectify the great wrong that had been done.
It's the end. It's the beginning.
Munich after the war was a battlefield between leftist revolutionaries and rightist paramilitary groups. Hitler, not having anything to return to in civilian life, wished to stay in the army and was recruited to spy on the dozens of small political parties that were springing into existence. It was at a meeting of one of them, the German Workers' Party, that Hitler jumped to his feet and tongue-lashed the speaker for advocating Bavarian independence. His performance was so impressive that he was invited to join the party and make speeches. And that, as they say, was that. A career was born.
Pride is a weapon. A sword that we can wield against our enemies. The socialists, the communists, the foreign invaders who come to our lands to destroy us and take over our lives.
One of the enduring mysteries that has swirled around Hitler is when did he become virulently anti-Semitic? Up to this time, he's been a common garden variety bigot. But in this post-war period, Hitler met the only mentor he ever had, a strongly anti-Semitic playwright, journalist, and alcoholic named Dietrich Eckart.
And when he mentioned him, sometimes tears would well up in his eyes.
Oh, well, he was good at that.
Yes.
Peter O'Toole has been cast as Reichspräsident Paul von Hindenburg. As a boy, he was terrified by seeing Hitler in newsreels.
This idea that up until 1920 he's a bit rough, you know, in his dialect and so on. He's a little bit rough. And then between 1920 and 1923, under the influence of Eckart, he starts...
Groomed.
He becomes groomed and starts speaking a little bit better.
He was an amazingly efficient parrot.
This person you've invited tonight, Herr Stengel, he has the workers' ear?
Some of the workers, but mostly the middle class, which is far better for our purposes.
Throughout his rise to power, Hitler was underestimated. The ruling classes were convinced they could use the rough, unmannered Austrian against the leftist threat. But also many historians believe that Hitler was a mediocrity, propelled by historical forces and extraordinary luck.
I mean, everybody has their own way of trying to get at him, get at the truth of him, but nobody, no one person ever really manages to sum up the staggering, colossal mediocrity of him, and at the same time, just the extraordinary ego, extraordinary grandiosity, and the sense of entitlement.
But does the view of Hitler as mediocrity make him more of a historical accident, and therefore less likely to happen again? A comforting thought if it's true, but dangerous if it's not. One of his victims was my cousin Roman Halter, today an architect and artist living in North London. Roman is a Holocaust survivor. His entire family perished in Auschwitz, and he spent the war as a slave laborer, deciding to become an architect the moment he first saw Dresden when he was shipped there in November '44.
I have never seen a beautiful city. It was the first time that the beauty of a city struck me. And that's quite extraordinary because I was starved, I was thin. I went through so many years of hardship and suffering and beatings, and yet the sense of beauty really touched me.
Roman survived the firebombing of Dresden by the Allies a few months later, when 100,000 plus civilians died. It gave him a perspective that is wider than most on horrors done in the name of war and called necessary. He has become a profound reader in the history of that period. I thought that if anyone had a legitimate right to pass judgment on how Hitler is presented, he does.
At one stage, they said he was a crazy man. He was not. He was a very able man. He was a meticulous planner. I don't know whether the world knows that when he wanted Albert Speer to build a great Reich, he handed over 160 architectural sketches, which have some merit. He knew about music, he knew about architecture, he had a phenomenal memory. He could get engrossed in particular details. When Lloyd George, who was a very astute man, went to visit him, he said he belongs to one of the greatest people in history. People were taken in by Hitler. One has to know about him. One has to know not only the one-sided man, but one has to turn him like a football, like a soccer, all the way around and study him, because he's so important to history. Not because he murdered so many people, but because such a man, ordinary man, managed to achieve such extraordinary power and then use the power in order to hold it. No matter how many people try to do away with him, nobody succeeded, really.
Part of the key to understanding how Hitler obtained power is that he himself was able to use the very same archetypes of good and evil to manipulate public opinion. In 1922, Hitler led a failed putsch in Munich, resulting in the death of 13 members of the party. It was an event he would later turn into a yearly passion play ritual.
There's a war going on. Get the fuck out of here.
They are the ones who deserve freedom!
He was able to hijack the resulting trial by appealing to nationalism and fear of foreigners. He spent only 1 year in prison and was given all the amenities needed to write Mein Kampf, an autobiography that was intended to be more myth-creating than factual.
I demand freedom!
When he emerged, he retreated to the Olympian heights of the Bavarian Alps, where he watched his enemies in the party fight it out among themselves, as his stature grew in absentia. When he brought his half-sister Angela to be his housekeeper, love intruded in the person of his niece, Gaily Raubel. There is little doubt that Gaily was the only woman Hitler ever romantically loved.
Gailey's changed quite a bit since you last saw her.
True to form, he began to control her life.
And this will be our Führer's office. Grand, spacious, inviting in the sun, as he does.
Through the mid and late 20s, the party grew in popular support as more and more desperate and humiliated Germans bought into the Nazis' Aryan mythology of racial superiority, and Hitler as the savior who could do no wrong.
6.5 billion votes, 107 seats.
Nazism's ideology is actually based on very old religious archetypes of oppression and salvation, of demons and saviors. The message of Nazism is that simple. It's just about getting rid of the baddies and having a rule of the goodies forever, except these baddies and goodies are no more than projections of one's own embattled, suffering self. In a sense, Nazism sets itself an impossible agenda. It seeks to eliminate all that besieges or embattles the self, because the self has a profoundly distorted, dysfunctional relationship to the outside world. And in that respect, it is, in a sense, the murder of the shadow. The self cannot tolerate the shadow, therefore the self can only obliterate and exterminate the shadow. Except in this time, it has been projected onto human agents, the Jews, the Bolsheviks, the communists, the trades unionists, whatever.
After the crash of '29, the National Socialists grew to be the largest party in the Reichstag. But for Hitler, the shadow was about to intrude darkly into his world. Gaily had decided to bolt for her freedom. She wanted to go to Vienna. Hitler forbade it. While he was on a campaign trip, she killed herself with his revolver. Some historians have speculated that subsequent history might have been very different had she not died. The script plays with the rumors of the day, that Hitler himself had either shot her or had her shot, something the most rigorous of historians, like Ian Kershaw, do not buy into.
That's a good segue probably into our Kershaw discussion. In a way, we have a greater freedom. He is a historian. His entire name is synonymous with detail, meticulous research, painstaking, detail that I think exposes the fundamental reason for why Ian needed to ultimately pull out. the fact that he slept in 4 different flop houses during his period in Vienna is not really something that a television viewing audience wants to pay attention to. So how do you address that? How do you disarm that? There are 3 very prominent Jewish rabbis looking at the script of the Christmas holidays, and there will be 5 or 6 world-renowned Hitler historians from Yale and Harvard and UCLA who will be reading this over the Christmas holidays as well. And I'm to hear all their comments in the new year and do what I can to implement them into our film, which is already shooting. So, you do that.
You'll be writing the script
Until we call rap.
Until you broadcast it.
See my room? This is where I will be living.
In mythic terms, the hero offers us the archetype of good in opposition to evil. Though most of the opposition to Hitler came from the leftist Munich Post, the film has focused on an almost forgotten conservative Catholic newspaperman, Fritz Gerlich, who felt it was his spiritual duty to expose the lie at the heart of the Nazi racist mythology.
I love you, Sophie. But if I don't do this, I won't be able to live with myself. Do you understand?
I'm frightened, Fritz.
Gerlich was arrested in March '33. He was murdered in Dachau during the Night of the Long Knives, when Hitler settled scores with his enemies. But while the filmmakers show us a hero following the dictates of conscience, another filmmaker, out of his own experience, considers those kinds of heroics naive. My head professor managed to do his 50 feature films under every regime from the 30s on. The Nazis, the republics, and all the flavors of communism.
It makes no sense to be a hero in such a situation and say, I'm against you. This is romanticism. To pose as a hero in protest. They shoot you, and that ends it.
My own Fritz Gerlich was Wawra's teaching assistant, the director Ewald Schorm. Unlike Wawra, he refused to sign a paper agreeing with the 1968 Soviet invasion. He had to leave the school and was only able to return to filmmaking shortly before his death in 1988. One of the Czech actors on the set told me he died an embittered man. History is usually more complex than the stories we tell about it.
Do you solemnly swear?
Convinced that Hitler would be tamed by power, President Hindenburg agreed to make him chancellor. A few weeks later, fire was set to the Reichstag by a Dutch leftist. Hitler had the excuse he needed to go to Hindenburg with an act that would suspend all civil liberties.
These are troubled times, sir. The Constitution could not anticipate them. A national monument has been destroyed. Our democracy is under attack. If we're to wage war on these foreign infiltrators, certain civil rights must be suspended.
After Hindenburg's death, the presidency and chancellorship were combined. Hitler's power was absolute, and the nightmare that was Nazism began its dark shadow dance with the German people. The miniseries shoot ground on, winter flu ripping through the close quarters of cast and crew, worsened by long days standing out in the cold. Bobby Carlyle, like a good method actor, absorbed himself into his role, becoming more and more inaccessible to everyone, including me and my camera. Toward the end of my filming, I paid a visit to Munich. On a snowy morning, I stood in the Odeonplatz, where the image of Hitler first emerged out of the crowd during the declaration of World War I. Though the buildings are mostly there, the Munich of Hitler's years has largely disappeared. Almost as if the city that gave him his political birth would prefer it if he was never born. His apartment building, where Gailey killed herself, now houses a police station. The Hofbrauhaus, where his career was launched, is now a mandatory tourist stop, not for Hitler, for the beer. History is always receding. Recounting the past can never serve up reality as it truly was. At the same time, storytelling is a necessary part of its transmission, a map to the territory. Still, I'm reminded that the map is not the territory, it only simplifies the terrain. Hitler, like all of us, was a human being, with all the complexity of human beings. If he becomes for us a cardboard cutout, a stand-in for evil, in a way his evil wins. It's a perfect disguise. Over at the Königsplatz, despite the noise of the traffic, I could almost hear the ordered columns of hundreds of thousands, gathered in the yearly ritual to memorialize 13 men who died in the beer hall putsch. Standing there, I was overwhelmed by the deepest revulsion I have ever known. It stayed through lunch, and during the long drive back to Prague it faded, but it did not disappear.